Hi, everyone. It's Lynn Toman. Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm excited to be here with Dr. Robert Cialdini. He is the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today best-selling author of Influence, which has sold over 5 million copies. Warren Buffett and his partner Charlie Munger call Dr. Cialdini's book Influence one of the most important books they've ever read. Dr. Cialdini has spent his entire career conducting scientific research on what leads people to say yes. He will share today how we can all use the tactics of influence and persuasion to get people to say yes to us, and he's also going to share how we can avoid being manipulated by others. Welcome, Bob, and thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be with you, Lynn.
It is my pleasure. I really enjoyed your book. I was also horrified at how well the tactics work. How did you first become interested in influence?
All my life, I'd been a sucker. I've always been a pushover for the appeals of various kinds of salespeople or fundraisers who've come to my door, and I would find myself in unwanted possession of these things that I didn't really want, contributing to causes I had hardly heard about. And it occurred to me there must be something other than the merits of the offer that got me to say yes. It must have been the way the offer and its merits were presented to me, the psychological delivery system that made the difference. And I thought, that's worth understanding and investigating for more than just reasons of self-defense, because I thought people in general would be interested in knowing about that aspect of human behavior. And it turns out I was right to think that, because people stop me all the time and say, can you help me be more influential, or could you help me defend myself against people who are trying to influence me in some form of unwelcome or undue fashion?
Your principles of influence and persuasion and the simple tactics really demolish the belief that we are making decisions rationally and of our own free will. These tools are so powerful that I'm shocked that even you, as a scholar of influence, have been manipulated by them. It's extraordinary.
It is, and I think part of the reason that it seems unusual that even I, who studies the influence process, would be swept by them from time to time, I still am, is how primitive they are. By that I don't mean it primitive in the derogatory sense of crude or brutish. I mean fundamental. I mean elemental to the way we function. They are the things that have evolved over eons and that we are socialized into, that lend themselves to assent, the things that lead us to choose to say yes to requests or proposals or recommendations.
Can you tell us about reciprocity and give us some examples? I was really amused and shocked at your example of the waiter, Vincent.
Yes. So, one of the things that we've learned about human behavior that exists in all human cultures, there's not a single society that fails to train its members from childhood in this rule, and that is that we are obligated to give back to others who have first given to us. So one study that was done in restaurants showed that if a server puts on the tray with the bill at the end of the meal, again, all the merits of the case have already been decided. The food has been ordered, it's been prepared, it's been served, it's been consumed, it's been cleared. All of that is done. If the waiter puts a mint on the tray for each diner, the server's tip goes up 3.3%. because people give back to those who have given to them, even something as small as a mint. Now, to instantiate this even further, the researchers showed that if the server put 2 mints on the tray for each diner, tips went up 14%. I mean, what this tells me is something I advise people who say they go into a new situation, maybe a new employment situation. They want to be more influential within this group, and they go into a room. They should not say to themselves, of the people in that room, who can most help me here? The question they should ask first is, whom can I most help here? Whose circumstances can I elevate? Whose outcomes can I enhance? Because by this rule that's been installed in every one of those people in that room, they will stand ready to help in return in ways that you see especially valuable for what you need.
Can you talk about the waiter, Vincent? I thought that was a really amusing example.
Yeah. Now, what Vincent did in the situations that I observed, what I did before I wrote the book was to try to get into as many influence professions as I could possibly get access to, and I would observe what they did and take their training. Well, in the restaurant industry, they live on tips. There was a guy named Vincent in one of the restaurants that I observed who was always the one who got the greatest tips. Right? And he combined two principles, one of which is reciprocity, in how he arranged for people to give him the largest tip and buy the most food so that the tip would be figured on a larger base, right? So let's say it was a large group, 8 to 10. He would reserve this particular strategy for that one. He would begin by taking orders of the first person, and whatever that person ordered, he would pause. His pen would pause over his pad. He would lean down so everyone at the table could hear, and he'd give the whole table a gift. He would say, "You know what? That's not as good tonight as it usually is." And then he would recommend something slightly less expensive from the menu. What that did, first of all, was to say, oh, we've just received from this man. He's given us valuable information. And besides that, he's a credible source of information because he wasn't recommending the top of the line. Instead, he was recommending something less expensive, which certified him as interested in our interests, right, in our satisfaction here. Then, when he would volunteer, would you like me to suggest a wine for the table or vintages with your food? Or when he would come back and recommend the desserts, people would say, of course, Vincent. You've done this for us already. You know what's good here. And Vincent would pile on additional charges to the bill. And he had already established that the percentage of the bill he would receive as a gratuity was high because of the rule for reciprocity. He would every month outstrip everyone else on the wait staff by what he did.
Can you talk a bit more about how personalization can magnify the power of reciprocation?
Yes. So if we want an accelerant to the principle of reciprocation, something that really increases its impact, it should be that what we give first should be something that's personalized to the preferences, the challenges, or the needs of the people who we are giving to. I have a colleague in Europe who is a speaker's agent, and she represents me in Central Europe. And she has one particular client who is notoriously a late payer. He takes 6 months to pay his bills, the invoices. This is very difficult for her business. And she began doing something based on the rule for reciprocity that significantly reduced the amount of time that it took him to pay the invoice. She would include with the invoice a little gift Sometimes it was a little box of chocolates. It might be a Starbucks gift card or something like this. And the time to pay went from 6 months to 3 months. Now she's using personalization. She learned that he was a modern aficionado. He loved modern art. Well, he was located in a different city than she was. So she went to her local modern art museum and galleries and would get these little postcards of exhibits that were shown only there, right? And then she would include one of those postcards, modern art, for someone who loves modern art. She says she now gets paid immediately. And her colleagues are all asking her, how did you do this? And she said, I'm not telling them.
And you found that sometimes where people or organizations create problems that somebody can solve makes people even more appreciative than flawless service?
This is a bullseye's observation, because there's something about solving a problem that people have with you, your products, your service, your idea. In this case, it was a hotel. And research shows that those people who are most likely to refer your hotel or remain loyal to it, come back and be guests again, are not those who experienced a seamless time there. It was those who experienced a problem that was rapidly and personally resolved for them by the staff. And I think I know why. When there's a problem and somebody fixes the particular problem you have, it's a personalized gift to you. And let me give you an example. There was a case in a hotel that had a tennis court associated with a couple of tennis courts. And there was a guest who went to play tennis with her 2 young children. And it turns out that the hotel's 2 children-sized tennis rackets were in use. What the manager did was to send one of his assistants to a local sporting goods store just down the street, buy 2 more child-sized rackets, and have them for the family to play within 15 minutes. Later that day, the woman, the mother, came back and said, I just booked my entire extended family into your hotel for the 4th of July weekend because of what you did for me this morning. Now, here's the point that I think reflects your point. If there hadn't been that mistake, if, let's say, the hotel stocked 4 children's rackets and were just given to the family, okay, here's the 2 rackets, right? There wouldn't even have been a blip of gratitude on the mother's radar. But because there was a problem that was resolved in a personalized way, in a special way, something special was due in return.
These strategies to me are so fascinating, and the practices are just simple. Can you talk about commitment and consistency?
Yes. So one of the tendencies we have, something that's been socialized into us from childhood, as well as the need to reciprocate, is the need to be consistent with what we have already committed ourselves to, especially in public, what we have previously said or done. And the best example of this, I know, comes from a study that was done in a restaurant in Chicago, where the restaurant owner was having trouble with no-shows, people who would call, book a table, and then not appear for it. He went and listened to what his receptionist said when she took a reservation. It was, thank you for calling Gordon's Restaurant. Please call if you have to change or cancel your reservation. That was producing 30% no-shows. He asked her to add 2 words. Instead of saying, please call, say, will you please call if you have to change or cancel your reservation? And then he instructed her to pause. The pause was crucial because in that silence, everybody said, sure, glad to, of course. And that was their commitment. And no shows dropped from 30% to 10% immediately because people went on record saying they would call if they had to cancel or they lived up to their reservation. So the instructive thing was getting people to make a small commitment, and then people want to be congruent with what they have already said or done in a consistent way.
I'm just realizing, Bob, a mistake I made with you before we started when I asked you for a favor. I didn't pause to wait for you to say, yes, I will.
Right, but you landed on it.
Social proof is another one of your very powerful strategies. Can you tell us about that?
Certainly. Very frequently in modern life, we're uncertain about the right step to take forward because there are so many choices, there's so much information that we have to deal with. And one way that we can reduce that uncertainty is to look at what others have done or are doing. Something like star ratings online and so on. Here's an example. There was a set of restaurants. I'm using restaurants a lot now because we've all been in one. In Beijing, there was a string of restaurants that put a little asterisk next to certain items on their menu. And as a result, purchase of those dishes rose by 13 to 20%. Well, what did the asterisk stand for? It didn't stand for, this is one of our house specialties, or this is the chef's selection for the evening. That's what we typically see. It stood for, this is one of our most popular items. And each one became 13 to 20% more popular for its popularity. A simple thing like that can greatly increase the likelihood that people will move in a direction because it reduces their uncertainty. Now, here's the best evidence I know that it was about uncertainty that drove that effect. The researchers looked at the demographic characteristics of the various kinds of people in those restaurants, and it turns out that this strategy of putting the asterisk there increased food purchases for all kinds of demographic categories, for men, for women, for young people, for older people. But there was one group that outdistanced all the others. First-time guests. People who were uncertain about what were the most delicious items on the menu. They were taking their cue from social proof.
I was shocked that social proof can even sway us when we think we're being really objective, such as when there's a remote audience watching one of the presidential debates.
Yes, this was a data set that troubled me when I read it, but it turns out that in presidential debates, not during the years of COVID where there wasn't a live audience, but prior to that, researchers looked at the amount of applause that a particular candidate would get during the debate from the audience and how that affected the perception of remote audiences, those who were watching it on TV or listening on radio. And even when the researchers manipulated the amount of applause, it wasn't the actual applause that they received. It just seemed like it was. Whoever got the most applause got the most positive ratings by those who were watching the event. It wasn't just the merits of what they saw. It was the way those merits were surrounded by social factors like social proof.
And of course, the people watching the debate remotely were completely oblivious to this effect on their perception of the debate.
That's right, and that applies very often to most of the principles of influence. We don't even recognize that they're moving us around in powerful ways.
And how do we get hooked by scarcity? How does that work?
Well, the scarcity principle says that people want more of those things they can have less of. So, if an individual can honestly inform us that something is rare or scarce or dwindling in availability, we're much more likely to move in its direction as a result. I saw an article that looked at 6,700 online commercial sites in which they were using A/B tests. They would include one factor or remove that factor to see what effect that had on conversions. And the top factor was whether there was a limited number of options at a particular price or with a particular payment plan or something like that.
I find it just amazing that if somebody sees something as simple as 2 cookies in a jar and is given one of those cookies, they think that that cookie actually tastes better than if there was a jar with 10 cookies and they are given one of 10 cookies.
The same cookie, they all came out of the same Nabisco box in the back room. They rate that cookie better because it was scarcer.
Liking is another one of the strategies of influence and persuasion. You call it the friendly thief. Can you tell us about it and give an example or some examples of how one can get people to like you?
Yes. No one would be surprised to know that we prefer to say yes to those people we like. But there are 2 very simple strategies we can use to enhance that sense of rapport people feel with us. One is to identify genuine similarities that exist, and the other is to give genuine compliments where they are warranted. And I'll say something now, it's kind of an admission. That last one, giving genuine compliments, is my biggest weakness. For some reason, it has to do with the way I was raised. I haven't given really deserved praise in situations where I should. I can't tell you how many times I've been in research meetings with graduate students and said to myself, geez, that was a brilliant thing that Lynn just said. Or, oh, how Roger just summarized our situation is exactly right. And I say it to myself, and I miss all of the goodwill that would come from a genuine compliment. I don't do that any longer. I specifically make sure that when I hear myself saying something complimentary about a person, in my mind, I transfer it from my mind to my tongue. And the consequences have been remarkably positive for all concerned. There's just a goodwill that results. And why would I hoard that compliment? I'm puzzled by that, but I've fixed it now, and it makes a big difference. I'll give you an example where it's worked terrifically for me. I have a newspaper deliverer. His name is Carl. And every morning for years, he's rolled by my house and he throws my morning newspaper from the window of his car onto my driveway. And most of the time, about 75% of the time, he gets it in the middle of the driveway so it doesn't get wet from the watering systems on either side. And also, every year, he includes around the holidays a little envelope, self-addressed envelope, which I know is an envelope where I can put a tip for him, a check for his service during the year. And I always do. But this past year, I included a note. I said, Carl, I want to thank you for your conscientiousness in getting my newspaper in the middle of the driveway most of the time so it doesn't get wet. Lynn, in the past, he would get it in the middle about 75% of the time. So far this year, 100%.
That is phenomenal. So compliment a lot and compliment a behavior that you want more of.
Precisely right. With that compliment, give people a reputation to live up to.
So trustworthiness is another one of your principles. What are the strategies to get someone to trust us?
You know, there's one particular form of communicator that is the most effective we have ever uncovered in behavioral science. It's the credible communicator. The person who has two elements. One is knowledge, authority, background, experience, credentials, these kinds of things, right? The other is trustworthiness. The idea that this expert information that this person is providing is being offered in an honest, unbiased way. Not designed to line their own pockets, but to accurately depict reality for us. And it turns out that it's possible to get instant trustworthiness by using a small device that most of us don't recognize, and that is the use of weaknesses in our case, of drawbacks in our case, that we mention immediately before we deliver our strongest argument. So, if I am trying to convince you to a particular point of view, and I'm giving you all the strongest arguments, the most compelling features of it, the most attractive aspects of it, if you don't see me as a trustworthy person yet, those things aren't getting through. But if before I mention all of my strongest arguments, I mention a weakness, I mention a drawback in my case, now you see me as trustworthy because I'm first of all knowledgeable about the pros and the cons, but secondly, I'm honest enough to talk about the weaknesses as well as the strengths. And now when you present your strongest arguments, I will be readied to believe you fully because you've shown me that you are a credible source of information. Well, that strategy produces instant trustworthiness. All we have to do is move the weaknesses from the very end of our presentation, which we typically do if we present them at all, to somewhere near the beginning. You've just established yourself as a credible source of information, and people are going to listen more deeply and believe more fully the next thing you say. That should be the place for your strongest point.
I was fascinated that Warren Buffett does that.
Warren Buffett does it on the first or second page of text of every one of his letters to shareholders that he writes every year by describing something that went south, something that didn't go well that year, a mistake they made. And he says, we know better now. We know not to do that ever again. And then he describes all the strengths. I get these newsletters, and I can't tell you, Lynn, every time it takes me aback because it's so different from what you normally see in these annual reports where they bury any weaknesses and footnotes on page 42. He does it right up front. He establishes his credibility, his honesty, and I believe the next thing he says every time because he's just shown me his honesty. And then he says, well, let's talk about all the things we've done right.
Can you tell us about the contrast principle, which is another one of the strategies that you talk about that can be undetectable to most people?
Yes. So, for example, it's a physiological and a perceptual feature of us that when we are presented with two items consecutively, and they are relatively different from one another. Let's say I ask you to lift a heavy object first, a bowling ball, and then I ask you to lift a much lighter object, a baseball. You will experience the baseball as lighter than you would if I hadn't asked you to pick up the bowling ball first. In contrast to the heavier object, the lighter one seems lighter than it actually is. This is something that is employed, for example, by car salesmen who first get you to decide on the overall price, the base price for a new car, and then they will suggest upgrades of one sort, better wheel covers or better sound system. So compared to the many $1,000 price that you've already been made to think about, This new one seems trivial in comparison. And people stand in amazement at the end of the deal with all of these upgrades, how the base price has ballooned out of proportion because they've bought all these things that were presented one at a time after the larger price was established, the base price.
The rejection and retreat strategy is very similar to me, again, because the person on the receiving end doesn't realize what's happened. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, it's the tendency to, because of the rule for reciprocation and the rule for contrast working together, here's a technique that works very well. In fact, my research team did it. We walked up to people on campus, students, and said, we're here from the Arizona Blood Services Organization, and we're asking for people who'd be willing to serve as a long-term blood donor to come in every 6 weeks for 2 years and donate blood. Would you be willing to do that? That was a very large request. Everybody said no. They said, 2 years? I don't even know where I'll be in 2 years. I can't commit to that. And then we said, oh, if you can't do that, would you be willing to give a single unit of blood tomorrow at the campus blood drive? We had asked people as well, just for that small request. Would you be willing to, just walk up without the larger one? If we did that, we got 33% of the people said, yes, I will do it. But if we started with the large request and then retreated to the small request, smaller request, now 55% show up at the blood center. In this case, a combination of retreating from a large request to a small request was to give a concession, and people had to give a concession in return to us. But it also used the contrast principle, because compared to giving a unit of blood every 6 weeks for 2 years, a single unit seems smaller.
It's so shocking. Loss aversion is another one of your principles and strategies. And it was so interesting to me that using loss aversion and framing something as, quote, we have a deal, all you have to do is agree to this proposal, unquote, is so much more effective than saying, quote, all you have to do is agree to this proposal and then we'll have a deal. Can you explain that?
Yes. Now, it has to do with something that I know one of your previous guests, Daniel Kahneman, has found to be the case, and it is that inside our tendencies, we are more motivated to avoid losses than to obtain gains of the very same thing. This fits under the idea of scarcity, because loss is the ultimate form of scarcity. I have a colleague, actually a friend, who's a divorce attorney, who also does mediation. And she will get couples into her offices, one per room. They can't be in the same room very often because the interactions break down. And they are trusting her to mediate a deal between them. And very frequently there's a last issue that they can't get beyond. And it torpedoes the whole process, and they wind up in divorce court where they didn't want to be in the first place. And she asked me, Bob, what could I do to get these people to agree on that last issue that they're just stuck on? And I said, well, what do you say to people when you bring from one room to the other that last offer? And she says, I say to them, if you will agree to this last proposal, we will have a deal. We will, in essence, be able to obtain a deal. I said, try this, Sandy. Go into the room and say, we have a deal. All you have to do is agree to this proposal. I saw her at a party a few months later. She came up to me. She said, Bob, this is amazing. This change works every time. And I said, Sandy, come on. Nothing works every time. She put her hand on my arm. Bob, every time. Why? Because if you say, all you have to do is agree to this proposal and we will have a deal, it means you are obtaining that deal. If you say to them, we have a deal, all you have to do is say yes to this proposal. If you say no, you're losing that deal. And Daniel Kahneman's research suggests you'll be 2.5 times as motivated to say yes to avoid a loss than to obtain the gain of the very same thing.
Bob, so far we've been talking about individual strategies and tactics. Can we shift slightly, and can you tell us the strategies and tactics that could be used if we were in two positions? Let's say we're the seller of a house. How do we get buyers to raise their prices? And the flip side of that, let's assume that we're the buyer of a house. How do we get the seller to reduce their price?
In both instances, I would use competition. That is to say, if you're the seller, you can honestly tell people how many others have been looking at the house and how many real estate agents have called you about it and so on. Give them honest information that there are others who are interested in this. So you have two things working for you there. One is social proof. A lot of other people are interested in the house. And you have scarcity. You might lose it. All right? You have loss aversion. In the case of the buyer, you honestly say, we're looking at several places, and we want to choose the one that would give us the best overall deal. So now the seller is in competition against other sellers and has to recognize that they have to sharpen their pencil and provide a better offer than these others might. So in both cases, if you do that honestly, you've invoked the rule of scarcity and competition for scarce resources.
Interesting. What are the biggest mistakes that you see people making, and how do we protect ourselves from all of these remarkably effective strategies being used on us?
That I'm going to answer as two separate questions. Here's the biggest mistake I see people making when they try to be influential, when they try to be more persuasive. They try to identify a favorite strategy, a favorite approach that they can take. They ask me, so what's the strongest, what's the most powerful, what's the best procedure I should use to get people to move in my direction? Well, I answer that by describing a research program that a colleague of mine initiated. He's a marketing professor, to find the single most effective influence approach, the one that works across the widest range of situations and so on, that will be most effective because it's the most powerful. I saw him at a conference and I said, how's it going with that? He said, I found the single most effective influence approach. It is not to have a single influence approach. That's a fool's game. To think that the same strategy is going to work in all situations, on all audiences, with all manner of previous histories with you and so on, that's naive. What you do is you look for what's already there in the situation. Is there real authority there that you can point to? Is there real social proof? Is there real scarcity? Is there a real commitment that people have already made to a feature that's part of what you have to offer? You look for something that's there and you raise it to consciousness. That way, you're using something whose engine is already running. It just requires that you connect it to an individual's consciousness. And it strikes me that allows us to be ethical in all of this. We're not fabricating or creating or counterfeiting one or another of these principles dishonestly. We're simply pointing to something and allowing the power of that rule that normally steers people correctly to infuse our request. So that's what I would say if you're trying to be influential. Now, what's my advice to people who want to recognize and resist and be aware of these principles? Well, first of all, you have to know what those principles are. But it turns out just knowing those principles doesn't cover all the bases. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called Persuasion that has to do with the moment before a communicator sends his or her message. What can they do in the moment before that causes people to be sympathetic with the message before they've encountered it? So, for example, There was a study of a website. If people went to a website for a furniture store that had fluffy clouds on the wallpaper of the landing page, they were more willing to buy comfortable furniture. If the background wallpaper had pennies, they were more likely to prefer inexpensive furniture before they ever encountered the furniture itself. So what I'd say to people is to be sure that you're properly defended against these things. Don't just look at what this person is saying inside the message. Look at what they've arranged for you before they've sent that message. Ask yourself, because that's going to influence you as well. There's a study that shows if you go into a wine shop and the proprietor is playing German music, you're more likely to buy a German vintage. If the proprietor is playing French music, you're more likely to buy French wine. So whatever this person has put in at top of consciousness before you enter the sales space also influences it. So that's what I would say. Look not just at the message itself, look at what's happened before the message is sent.
Before I ask for your 3 takeaways, is there anything else you'd like to talk about that you haven't already discussed?
Well, just in terms of, a lot of people have asked me how they can get access to this information. We now have a training program at my website, influenceatwork.com, that provides a workshop on how people can learn to be ethical and effective at the same time. It's an online, on-demand workshop, so people might be interested in that.
And last, what are the 3 key takeaways or insights you'd like to leave the audience with today, Bob?
Here's what I'm going to suggest. I'm going to suggest one takeaway that has 3 dimensions to it. Let's do it that way. I have a colleague, when his son turned 13, he wanted to gather advice from his friends who thought might have good things to suggest that he could tell his son to do to equip him to be a young adult. And here was mine. When you go into a new situation where you don't know the people there, expect the best of them and from them, because that allows you to be generous with them. And that generosity has 3 important downstream consequences. First of all, the liking rule. They like you more for being generous with them. Second, the rule for reciprocation. They will give generosity back to you. And finally, commitment and consistency. In the process of seeing themselves, committing themselves to you with this generous set of outcomes that they provide you, they will want to be consistent with that into the future. And now you have 2 people interacting with one another who like each other and are committed to generosity toward one another. I think that's a good place for that young man to start off as a platform for his social interactions.
Bob, this has been wonderful. I loved your book. There's so much more in it that I would love to discuss with you, but we are out of time. I highly recommend your book and just want to say thank you. This has been terrific.
Well, I have to say I enjoyed our interactions, Lynn.